Good morning, dear participants. We continue second day of Donbass Media Forum, and welcome to our first discussion panel, which is dedicated to local election and local media. Today, the majority of our participants will join us via Zoom video conference, but we are also waiting for one guest in the studio. He will join us a bit later. And now, before I will tell you about our guests who will take part in the discussion, I would like to ask you to be active today, to leave your comments in the comments section on YouTube and Facebook. You can watch us uh, on Ukrinform stream as well as on the page in Facebook of Donetsk Institute of Information. I will try to ask all the questions to our speakers so they are able to take all your questions and we have productive discussions on the local elections and local media. So today we have with us to discuss these important questions Serhiy Postivyy, member of the Central Election Commission. He will join us later in the studio. Olha Aivazovska, chair of the board of the civil network OPORA, Anna Murlykina, editor-in-chief of the regional site 0629.com.ua in Mariupol, as well as Andriy Dikhtiarenko, journalist of the Donbass.Realii program on Radio Svoboda and editor-in-chief Luhansk media Realnaya Gazeta. I would like to start with telling you that the elections of 2020 pose a lot of challenges to our journalists, especially those who work in the regions of Ukraine. This election campaign is unique, particularly because we have a new election code. We have quite a complicated election code. It's quite difficult to understand some of the aspects of this legislation, even to those people who have been working in this sphere for many years in a row. And of course, journalists who are always busy and who sometimes don't have time to read all the details of these documents. It's even more complicated because the election process is the election campaign is quite fast and you need to do everything very quickly. So I would like to ask my colleagues, representatives of the media, please tell us, how do you plan to work uh, covering the local elections in your local media? What are the top three key challenges you see when covering this news? I would like to give floor to Anna Murlykina, editor-in-chief of the regional site 0629.com.ua from Kramatorsk. First of all, I would like to say hello to everyone. Well, how we will cover the election campaign? I think it won't be different than any other news that we cover. But even now, we face several challenges which are related to what you've just told at the beginning, with a lack of information, with a lack of expert opinion and experience. Well, we tried to read the new election code, but unfortunately, we lack expertise to be able to understand it completely. We had a lot of trainings for the media, and it helped, but we don't really know how the process will take place. We understand how the candidate before we understood how the candidates had to run the election campaign. Now everything is a bit more complicated. We didn't have the opportunity to understand whether some of the things were violations or not. We couldn't understand whether candidates or political parties could start their campaigning before the official start of the election campaign. So it was a bit complicated at first. Now we cooperate with OPORA network. They really help us. And we would like this cooperation to continue. We would like that those questions that we ask to be promptly replied to, because our work, the quality of our work depends on it. Because we are an online media, for example. OPORA is the organization that helps us a lot to understand all the peculiarities of the election code. Thanks so much, Anna. Andriy, what about you? Of course, you work in a regional media, but your media belongs to the national network. And Radio Svoboda works not only in Ukraine, but in many countries around the world. So, what challenges do you see when covering local election in local media, taking into account the shortage of time? Well, the thing is that I represent two media actually. The first media is aimed at global context, and we mostly cover conflict in the East. I mean, and the second one is aimed at telling about the conflict in the East. I mean, Donbass.Realii. And as for Realnaya Gazeta, we mostly write about local things, local events. Now it's a bit complicated. The problem is that the local authorities, the local government, this is what Anna told us about. The problem is the difference of the current elections. In 18 communities, the elections won't take place. And even in big cities of the Luhansk Oblast, such as Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, elections won't be held there. The problem with this election is interesting to us from the point of view of the global context. It's quite a strange precedent. In Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, for the 6 years of the conflict, elections were held. Elections to Verkhovna Rada, elections of the President of Ukraine. But I don't know why this year the government of Ukraine decided not to hold elections there. Civil and military administration was put into those cities where it lacked even during the active hostilities phase. So the problem is that the local people cannot choose their local authorities. I think it is quite dangerous. About 80% of the focus of my personal attention as editor-in-chief of Realnaya Gazeta and a journalist of the Donbass.Realii program will be aimed at this particular situation, because if people cannot choose their representatives legally, there I am afraid that the government might open some illegal avenues to this. I wouldn't like that to happen. So I hope that this situation might be somehow solved before it gets too dangerous. Well, I'd like to get back to this particular question when Serhiy Postivyy, member of the Central Election Commission, joins us later. So let's remember this question and we'll get back to it later. And now I would like to ask Olha Aivazovska. So today we've already talked about the fact that regional representative offices of OPORA really helps the local media. We also discussed the questions of the current elections. So Olha, can you please tell us, you as a representative of the civil network OPORA, how do you contribute to engaging more people to of awareness campaigns related to the elections 2020? How do you actually help to inform people about it? How do you help to provide more information to the population about the elections 2020? Good morning, dear colleagues, dear audience. Kateryna, I think this is a question to you rather, because you are representative of the communication department of OPORA. But of course, I would like to comment on the questions that were asked. It seems to me that the media shall not be afraid of the changes to the election code. Because although those provisions which regulate activities of the media, they actually are the same. There were not any changes. As for the campaigning in social networks, there are some changes. How we try to provide more information about the election campaign on our website, in social networks, on our Facebook page, there is a lot of current information which is relevant to the specific regions. We try to include legal interpretation of some events or the election code. That is why those media who follow this process, or journalists who follow this direction in the media, they can follow us, and day by day they become more qualified because we don't only describe an event, but we provide our interpretation of this event from the point of view of Ukrainian legislation or international standards. It is very important. For example, campaigning before the official start of the campaign is not regulated. At the same time, we try to provide our analysis. And of course, it gets less attention from the general audience, but it might be interesting for journalists who actually write about elections. So it seems to me it would be useful to them to read those detailed documents which explain the election code.
And who's guilty and what do we do with that? Because we're also trying to prepare guidelines, recommendations, because it's not enough just to state the problem, but you also have to give your vision. The discussion on the 18 communities, interesting, but now we know whose fault it was, and it's not like why it happened, but what could have been done to avoid it. And the third, we are to focus now on the question of holding it not on the 25th of October, of course, but these are going to be like, not the first elections, uh, ordinary elections, and they will keep on taking comments which in political field are announcing the information which gives us the possibility to state that it's a political decision, not a legal one, uh, and it's not to be like because there is no water in Severodonetsk, and obvious that we need to pay attention to it and ask when will these problems be solved. If you have a duty, a responsibility, then you have to set the deadline when by the time that you're going to solve the problem of the procurement for the kindergartens and proclaiming the elections, because you have to state that there is no dangerous situation right now, and it seems that media in this situation play the role of the judge partly because there are political stakeholders who are for or against, and sometimes the rhetoric is not adequate, and it can also hurt, the citizens of communities of to a more or less peaceful way of things there. Olha, we have here actually joining us the member of the Central Election Commission, and I would like to involve him into this discussion. So we do know that there is a problem, and Olga gave us a good hint why it happened. But I want to ask if you see any ways out of the situation, maybe in the perspective, what should we do? Maybe there was lack of communication. What do we do to avoid similar situations? Good day. I would like to apologize for being late. The question that you are discussing is topical, and it's been like this for quite a while. I am grateful and support the position of Olga. She has commented the information partly. Moreover, she already identified those guilty or those who have something to do with it. As for the position of the Central Election Commission and can the situation change or be corrected. Unfortunately, we are limited somehow, and we were in the situation not very simple as a body that is to provide administering and the implementation of the electoral rights of the citizens, which is our task and aim. But the provisions of the Central Election Commission defines one body that is competent to give conclusions on the safety component in the context of possibility or no possibility of holding elections. These are civil administrative administrations, and we received conclusions and couldn't ignore them. And we understood that the question of life of people is a priority. Moreover, what do we do next? In this case, we think that the elections can be appointed at any time. If we have a dynamic situation, then after receiving the conclusions of administrative administrations that the territories do not have certain threats, real or potential, and on such territories the elections can be carried out, then there will be a quick reaction to it. Right now, by the provisions of the election code, it is defined that elections will be appointed twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. And if by the spring the situation is going to have positive changes, the Central Election Commission is going to respond correspondingly. I understand that you make all decisions on the basis of the conclusions, but do you think that the communication component is lacking because uh, or social moods are connected with the lack of information? I have met lots of threats for a Central Election Commission in this decision when people don't understand that this decision is made on the basis of the conclusions of military administrative. And how do you set, the process of communication so to avoid, some false understanding? Well, we are already drawing conclusions. We started with adopting the strategy of the development of the Central Election Commission, and communication is part of it. Maybe we can speak about maybe we do not fully or haven't fully provided necessary communication through the sources that we are using today. I mean, our website, social networks, public events, official online session, streaming. We were trying to communicate information in any possible way, but really there was like a big informational splash that was based on one position. And only with time we saw, when we started, diving into these processes, and the civil network OPORA and other international organizations that analyzed it together with the Central Election Commission, we explained all the problematics and the normative regulation of it. And now there are less questions because we did had, the MP's request to, cancel all we have. But as at the end today, I know there are so all subjects that addressed us, they have found out all the problems and now are communicating with a competent body. As for this problem, journalist Andriy Dikhtiarenko started it today, and he is a journalist of the Donbass.Realii program and Luhansk media Realnaya Gazeta, and he said that all Ukrainian media project Radio Svoboda, they're all discussing this topic. So I would like to give floor to Andriy and ask questions to Serhiy. Thank you so much, Serhiy. So far, the situation looks on our level in the way that the Central Election Commission fully put responsibility for whether or not the elections will take place in these 18 amalgamated communities or if in military civil administration. So you just answered. So it depends upon the situation with the potential threats. It just looks weird. It seems like right now we have a peaceful peace, but still a, a number of people, of military and peaceful citizens who die along the contact line decreased. But what is to happen in the spring so that the Central Election Commission makes a different decision? I guess you are to say that this decision to be made by the military and civil administrations, but we know that this administration is the direct vertical of the president, and that's why lots of observers are blaming this administration in the political engagement. So the second question, when you discuss questions of uh, postponing local elections, do you conduct some discussions? Me as a journalist is curious to find out how was this decision made to cancel or postpone the elections in these 18 amalgamated communities. Was it we did have discussions, and not one of them. As I mentioned, the decision was not easy to make. We had lots of discussions. Moreover, first we made the decision to not appoint elections in 18 amalgamated communities. Later on, the decision was made of appointing elections to regional councils, and the Central Election Commission widened the specter of the requested information, and we communicated with the Security Service of Ukraine, of the law enforcement agencies, and we reacted to the situation that was emerging in the society, all those complaints, of the Central Election Commission on how objectively we were, considering all the circumstances to make a good decision. So when we received the decisions, repeatedly decisions, and they were the same. And in these conclusions, they not only mentioned the description of the real threat today, but also about potential threats and perspective. The Central Election Commission is not the competent body that has the possibility to exercise evaluation of the safety component. We are no experts in this area. We don't understand how to focus these or those consequences because we do not have full information on what is happening in the occupied or deoccupied areas, or which are under control but which are along the contact line. So the position of Central Election Commission is based only on provisions and norms of the law of the electoral code, and we cannot violate its framework. What can change in the spring or not in the spring? We are expecting for conclusions of the competent body in the context of what vertical it is, who subordinates to whom. I think it's not correct for us to give this kind of assessment because we are not competent here. We act only in the part according to the law and make decisions in the framework defined by the law. I know that we have questions, other speakers have questions because it's a painful topic. Maybe it's not about media, but still media specialists are interested in it and the target audience also find it interesting. So I would like to give floor to Anna Murlykina, editor-in-chief of the regional site 0629.com.ua. So she also has comments. Yes, thank you. The topic is very acute. I would like to ask uh, a question. When we speak about the safety component, whether or not we to make a decision or not to make decision, the safety component is the main one. But the problem of this amalgamated community is the
And there were always elections there. Starting from 2016, there are no active hostilities. The problem is that this amalgamated community now consists of those villages which are located near the front line. So I want to understand, is there a mechanism to tackle this issue? Because if there are no active hostilities, everything is okay. But in other settlements which are part of this amalgamated community, the situation might be not safe for a very long time from now. So there won't be any elections, right? Is there a mechanism to tackle this issue with the elections? Thank you. So, as far as I understand, the question is related to administrative and territorial questions, because some of the amalgamated communities were united. So it looks like that there is an amalgamated community right now, which includes settlements located along the front line. We have already discussed the conclusions, the consequences. As for how to tackle this issue, I think this is the question which shall be solved by the local government. Probably we can change the area of this amalgamated community in order to hold elections on the safe territory. But everything belongs on the local self-governing bodies. They need to work with oblast and administrations in order to change plans of these amalgamated communities. And changes can be made to the documents of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. I know that Olha Aivazovska has a comment to make, but we have another question which we got in the chat box, and I would like to ask our viewers to continue asking questions. We will ask our speakers those questions. Olha, can you please comment on the previous question and elaborate on the next question? You produce a lot of information content in the media sphere. So, in your personal experience, how do you cooperate with the media? Because we can say right now that the local media are more or less independent. Because good information campaign is also depends on the results of this campaign. Uh, the impartiality of the election campaign depends largely on the media. That is why it is necessary to see how experienced they are, how unbiased and professional they are. It is very important that the local media don't belong to a particular political candidate or a party in a place where they live and work. Thanks a lot, Katya. I would like to comment on the previous question. I invite the Central Election Committee and the Donetsk Institute of Information. Let's organize, let's work together, let's cooperate, and let's write a joint article about the situation with this particular amalgamated community. Because it seems like this problem is not being solved, and we need to do just that. I'm persuaded that I don't know when this election shall be held. If the situation changes for the better, probably we can hold this election sooner. Today, it was announced that the government of Ukraine will tackle this problem. So let's continue discussing that because it is a political and geopolitical question. It's very important. It's also an issue related to human rights, to social rights of the inhabitants who want to, people want to choose their representatives. It is an important part of the reintegration process in building trust of the citizens to the government. If we don't provide Lysychansk and Severodonetsk the opportunity to vote, there is a high risk that the trust in the institutions will fall. The Central Election Committee, if it made another decision, it would be highly risked. The Central Election Committee made this decision and it was political. But people might use other ways of gathering information about the situation locally. There is a need of qualified information about what is happening in this region. The society shall have trust in the government of Ukraine, in the security service of Ukraine. They need to trust these institutions and to have to have facts and to have the full information. In some communities, we understand that it is impossible to hold elections, but there are other elections which 100% need elections, and we need to understand why it was decided not to organize elections in these communities. Then, as Katya said, we produce a lot of informational materials, such as videos, because we know that a lot of people don't like to read. But we also have a lot of long reads, a lot of explainers. I see that regional media, local media in this campaign are interested in these materials even more than it was at the previous elections because they need to have access to truthful information. The problem is that the government adopted a lot of changes before this election campaign. And secondly, this is a local campaign. Journalists live in the same communities with the candidates, which who might violate the new election code. So they want to have the big picture. And I would like to say that we are always open to explain every concrete situation. We are ready to provide our expertise to the local media. As for bias, we we shall find answers in the election campaign. During the election campaign, the media shall act as businesses. If they are not businesses, they belong to someone else and they cannot provide unbiased information. If they belong to a candidate, they might publish a lot of prefabricated news. If they are paid for, if, for example, a candidate wants to advertise in this media, it shall be paid according to the legislation and it should be obvious to everyone. If there are violations during the campaign, it shall be exposed. But what shall we do with the candidates who have influence on the media or who are owners of the media? We need to do something with them because the conditions shall be equal for everyone. If a media belongs to a political candidate, uh, it cannot comment on the election campaign. Of course, they can write about other things, and their journalists might write their opinions on their personal pages. Last but not least, it is very important to follow the requirements of the new election code. Because there was a norm, a regulation according to which it was prohibited to comment on political programs or radio discussions. There shall be independent experts from different parties, from different political parties. For example, when we are watching central TV political talk shows, such as the right to power, they did contact us for explainers and for information, but it was an excellent case uh, because there were people who said that they were candidates, so they say that they are already taking part in the election campaign, though they haven't been registered yet. There are also opinionated thoughts of people who shall not comment on that. I would also like to ask the same question to Anna. How do you see this opportunity to maintain balance in the regions to prevent influence from the local politicians who may try to influence your covering of the local elections? I'd like to say that we work just as Olha says. We work as a business. Yes, we do have political advertising of all the participants of the local elections. We label it as political advertising. We take money for that officially. That is why I would like to say that we also have our own analytical materials, which we publish just because we think so. It's not for the money. In Mariupol, only one party who is that is registered has already presented its election program. But as I've already told you, we lack experts' opinion and we lack experts here on the regional level. There are few people like that. That is why we cooperate with you. But of course, we would like to widen the network of our experts, because this lack of expertise is an important problem for many, many regions of Ukraine. As for the other media in Mariupol, 90% of the media belong to Rinat Akhmetov. I'm not judging, but I'd like to say from the experience of the previous election campaigns, there were a lot of violations. These media were used and abused not as business but as vehicles of propaganda. And the problem is that at the legislative level, uh, there are no there are no conclusions. There is no punishment for that. And if there is no punishment, nothing changes. I would also like to ask Andriy Dikhtiarenko to comment on that, to say his final words on this. You, as a person who is part of a regional and a national media, having the opportunity to have access to a pool of experts, do you feel this lack of information and lack of expertise? And how you can evaluate the media community of the Luhansk region? Are they unbiased in covering the elections? First, I would like to thank Olha Aivazovska for for having suggested to discuss this topic of the elections. You can count on us. We will support you in this. And I will reach out to you later for an expert opinion. Secondly, what I would like to say about covering elections in Donbass, we know that there are a lot of settlements that are located along the contact line, and a lot of political parties use and abuse this highly vulnerable topic of war and peace. Let's not forget that the process of local elections goes on, but we need to understand that the information war also goes on. And a lot of sources manipulate those issues of the war and peace. Probably they distort this information. And sometimes sometimes candidates join this information war. That is why I would like to highlight the important role of the media in this process. Yes, of course, in the election times, the media shall be a business, but it's very important for the local media to focus on fact checking and checking those points which uh, published or spoken by candidates of different political parties. Because in any case, the local population consumes those news. The elections will happen or not, but all of this information which is spreaded in the media, in the mass media, and those media which were created specifically for the election or which are spreaded using different leaflets or newspapers, they will stay with the local population. So I would like to ask the media to keep this balance. How to do that? It's a difficult question. As for the Luhansk region, Luhansk Oblast, unfortunately, the majority of the local media are focused in large cities which are excluded from the election process. I don't know well the situation in Starobelsk. There are good, high-quality medias, and I haven't seen a super activity on the websites of these media, which go beyond the election process. We all understand that this election campaign is quite brief. Unfortunately, because of this short timeline, there might be some violations. We will follow the developments, and we will focus our attention on what is happening.
Thank you, Andriy. That's what I started with. We do not have much time, new legislation, lots of challenges, but another challenge that we're going through this year, it's COVID-19, and it is also reflected on the elections and on media. I know that, a working group was created in the Central Election Commission that offered recommendations on how to organize elections during COVID-19. I have several topical questions from our audience. I will join them and we will try to look for answers to these questions. So, question, how serious are the risks if the lockdown measures will be implemented in the way that they will not be well communicated or there will be no they won't be transparent enough. Tell us about this mechanism first. But the thing is, does the authority have to prohibit voting or observations and because of the lockdown measures? Is there a possibility according of normal decision, but a bit limitations which can lead to negative effects in the media context as well? And if we speak about distribution of zones, if elections in Donetsk are not appointed, but the red zone happens on the day of voting in other cities, or maybe even in Donetsk or Luhansk, where the elections will take place in those communities. So, is there a problem that if there is a red zone and no possibility to conduct elections? So tell us, please, what did you include into this document, and do you have answers to the questions that I just voiced? I do have something to say. I will share the information. Yes, we did have create the working group that includes lots of experts from the ministries, from the Ministry of Health, and we also involved the military epidemiologists who provided us lots of valuable information. Actually, since April, we addressed to many different bodies who were responsible for also for holding elections, and we were studying this experience. But this working group was supposed to develop recommendations because the Central Election Commission cannot make decisions on some, providing some recommendations to the executive branch on some actions. And this also refers to the individual protective measures, what kind, their types, which of them should be certified or are certified in Ukraine. So there were a number of questions where we are not competent, so we decided that we would develop our recommendations from the norms and provisions of the electoral code, not to violate the rights of all the subjects of the electoral process. And we have submitted them to the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, and now this question has been discussed, is being discussed by experts and employees of the ministries. The document is ready, as far as I know, this week. They plan to revise it and to adopt it. And I think that at the end of the next week we're going to see it. But the right to choose and the right to be chosen is actually covered by the Constitution. We can't restrict it because if something like that happens, then there's a criminal responsibility. That's to, and this refers to all subjects, not only voters or candidates, mass media including. So when developing recommendations, we recommended within the context of different cases because we cover different levels. As for voters, there are certain requirements to them. As for observers, candidates, and mass media, they also have a certain number of requirements. And even if there are signs, of some respiratory disease of the voters, this kind of voter, if he still insists on the realization of his electoral right, he will be given the right to realize his right. And but we did give the recommendation to Minister of Health that in this case it would be well to organize the work in the Commission to separate in the very particular building one urn and one cabin for people who have symptoms of respiratory disease, and the space to be disinfected after each such voter. Will there be observers or mass media representatives? Yes, because we did have the discussion, and by 641 resolution, the requirements on the distance between them, and there are no. It doesn't actually fit with the provisions of the electoral code. That's why we had to include this. Therefore, no, obstacles to mass media, no other observers, but there are certain recommendations in our interagency group. We offer to include the norm in the draft law of the resolution that no press events are going to take place in the polling station, but the representatives of mass media can be present there. But I understand there are cases when media or famous or candidates who are popular and they also vote, then there's a big public event. That's why in this case we would recommend mass media, if they want to interview them, to do it apart from, not somewhere outside, not in the polling station, to minimize the risk of infection. Also, we advise to let the voters enter in certain quantity, I mean, it shouldn't be more than 3 persons to each table of the documents, so that to control the number of persons who are at the same time in the polling stations. As for voters, there are other requirements to them, as I mean, concerning the disinfection measures and cleaning the tables every 2 hours and cleaning the floor every 4 hours. So we have developed many requirements to be more specific about which of them will be implemented. I think that next week we are going to see it in the adopted document by the government. I would like to ask the similar question to Olga. Olga Aivazovska, tell us, please, do you plan for observers such possibilities of potential restrictions or limitations in meters to be between the people? How will observers observe from the distance, or will the observers approach people and check the potential violations? Well, obviously that we are to find balance between safety and compliance with the electoral code and rights of citizens, including observers. So we plan, and we are already exercising procurement of the individual protective means. So we are using the recommendations of the Minister of Health. So when the government resolution is going to be adopted, we're going to use it in our activity. And it will apply also to observers who are going to be at the polling stations. But we insist that observation from the 10 meters distance is not effective or acceptable, and it's the limit, the violation of our rights. As for the protective measures, the healthy members of the committee or observers who come with any symptoms to the polling stations, they have to, of course, we are to follow all the recommendations and not to violate the electoral rights. So I would like to speak about the question of identification of red zones, and we received comments. Can you seriously consider a question that you will, very stiff lockdown measures would have to be introduced? Do you think there's a potential, uh, you know, possibility, when it's not going to be adaptive lockdown, but is it possible, this scenario, then the lockdown will have to be introduced again? So small comment for Olga. I would like to uh, reassure her that we did, in our recommendations, we did not include 10-meter space between people. We have, in our recommendation, it's not less than 1 meter, and all observers will have the possibility to observe from in any place that is not prohibited, but for the cabin itself, not to violate the secrecy of voting, and they will have the possibility to observe and will have the access to all information. So as for the red zones, this question is often raised, and really the electoral legislation foresees not so many cases when it cannot be or won't be conducted. And as for lockdown measures, and no clear recommendations is actually envisaged. We are only considering 2 cases. First is the military state and the emergency state. Introduction. Red zone, according to the resolution of the government, is not the ground to say that some elections cannot be carried out on certain territory. If theoretically, well, theoretically it is possible, of course, because it is possible that the state of emergency will be introduced, but according to the decree of the president, it has to be approved by the Verkhovna Rada. So such decisions, if are accepted, it's going to be on the highest political level. And as of today, we do not have information about certain perspectives uh, due to some lockdown measures to be introduced, that the elections must be postponed. Today, all state institutions are actively have actively joined to the preparatory state of the electoral process. Our first task to do it in correspondence with the provisions of the electoral code, world standards, and given the lockdown measures to provide safe conditions both for voters and for organizers of the electoral process. That's why we shouldn't speak about some abolitions today. But we have a problem with COVID. We have a problem with occupied territories. And there are people who think that electronic voting, as one of the ways to solve these problems. So, and there's a question about voting on the occupied territories. I would like for all of our experts to uh, give a word on this account. So, what do you think can help? I mean, do you think that the electronic voting can help to solve the problem with the COVID-19 or occupied territories voting? But will it be possible to highlight it in media, and to which extent this topic can be discussed right now in the media space? Because it seems to me that electronic voting is work of very narrow field of experts, but not of the wider publicity. So let's start with Andriy, Anna, Olga, and then we'll go back to the guest in the studio. Well, thank you. Really, it's an interesting topic that you are now trying to highlight. There are several questions. First, for certain communities where there are many people, using smartphones and who have access to the internet, electronic voting for them could be effective. But we know that in the pre-front territory and the occupied territories, people do not always have access to smartphones. And I know the situation when the checkpoint is crossed by the pensioners, and I mean, can't imagine the situation where these pensioners have to buy the smartphone to install Dia on the smartphone. I think it's a matter of discussion, but I don't think that for 100% of voters this could be a way out.
Now media must cover alternative ways for these people to vote in the next election. Yes, we need to find those mechanisms and write about them. This is an excellent topic, and I think we need to focus on that. I know that Anna Murlykina had a question related to this particular topic about how the elections will cost during the lockdown if they will be held offline. But I would also like to ask you, do you think that online elections might be really feasible? I think this is an excellent topic, but to start talking about it, we need a nudge, we need an impetus. We try to understand the technical peculiarities for voting online. We were told that this issue can only be solved within the next 2 or 3 years. So there are a lot of problems related to that. So if it will take from 2 to 3 years, we cannot talk about it for the next elections. It seems to me that in any case, it is a good way to vote, especially for the young people. Those a lot of them don't want to vote offline, so probably they would vote online. As for the occupied territories, I have doubts whether it might be interesting for them. For 4 years, we've been fighting for the right for IDPs to vote. This year, this right, these people finally received this right. But when we see information on how many people changed the address for voting, I have a question. Was it worth those efforts? Because actually, very few people changed their address to vote. That is why it seems to me that information campaign is definitely needed. It shall be an important communication campaign in order to raise awareness, to raise interest of these people in this opportunity to vote online or to change the voting address. Of course, I know the position of OPORA, but I would like to ask Olha to comment on their position. Do you think that online voting might be a way to overcome some concerns or challenges related to elections during lockdown? Or might it be an opportunity to implement voting rights in the occupied territories? Well, personally, I think there are low chances to postpone elections, to delay elections. In this case, I think that postponing elections is might be the only way it can be done. But I'm sure that every political party presented in the parliament will evaluate pros and cons of these elections, and they might postpone it, won't postpone it. Because we don't know if the state of emergency will be imposed. We cannot forecast how many people infected with COVID-19 will we have. Most probably, the epidemiological situation will worsen. That is why postponing elections might be a problem. We need to hold these elections and then move forward, continue fighting the pandemic locally. As for the second question about voting of IDPs, I'm sure that this decision was efficient. As of 10th September, 92,000 people were registered. So we are waiting for the final numbers. I think there will be several dozens, thousands more. So these are good results. Well, there were several violations, and we need to tackle them until there are further problems. As for the voting in the occupied territories, my position and the position of OPORA is that we are against it in the current conditions because it would be difficult to organize such elections according to the constitution and according to the election code and international standards. Uh, there shall be a transitional period which shall start not from the first day of ceasefire, but from the transit of these occupied territories into the legal space of Ukraine, because we need to. The state must control law enforcement agencies and all the relevant institutions to be able to hold elections. And the last question about online elections. I think that IT people in Ukraine think that we can do that because we have 3G, 4G, and we'll have 5G soon. Most people have computers and smartphones, but in reality, the situation is a bit more complicated. It's not only about the technologies, it is about protecting the system, protecting it against violations, because uh, because there might be violations from Russia, China, or the US, which are actually. I don't say that they interfere in other elections, but it seems to me that the interference of Russia in other elections in other parts of the world has been already proved. Thanks, Olha. Sorry for interrupting you, but we don't have enough time, unfortunately. Serhiy, can you please voice your opinion, your position, your personal and the position of the Central Election Committee on the possibilities of voting in the occupied territories and the online voting? As for the online voting, I can say that we differentiate online voting and voting using different programs or gadgets or machines. As for the online voting or internet voting, as the Central Election Committee, we have voiced our concerns about making this decision. We actively cooperate with the Ministry of Digital Transformation, with international organizations. I'm also head of the working group, which actually introduces information technologies into this process. And we plan to organize a forum to showcase the pros and cons of using information technologies in the election process. We can only say that Estonia is probably the only country which uses efficiently the process of online voting. At the previous elections, they started using these technologies, and they used it somehow since its independence. So they are the most experienced in it. During the previous elections, if I'm not mistaken, only 40% of voters used online voting. What are the risks? I really like this idea. I support this idea. But until we find the way to provide safety and security of identification of voters in the system, to preserve the secrecy of the vote, until we tackle these issues, I think it is too soon to make any important decisions. Internet voting is voting in an uncontrolled space. For example, there might be one, if this voting is held, for example, in a place, in a settlement, there might be a big owner of, for example, a big plant, and he might force to everyone to vote for him from the same computer. The second problem is sorry, unfortunately, we don't have enough time. So, and the second question is the trust in the election process. It is very easy to distort to this trust, and any fake news from the part of the aggressor state might impact this process. And we see from our history, started from the Orange Revolution, that we might have a lot of distrust in the election process. We need to tackle those issues. I would like to thank you, Serhiy, and all participants of the discussion. Thanks, Olha, Anna, and Andriy, for taking part in our Zoom conference on this important topic. I would also like to remind you that in 15 minutes we will start our next discussion, which is called COVID-19 Pandemic and the European Media, Europe's Ways Out of the Coronavirus Crisis. We'll have with us a lot of international experts, so please join us later, 11:30 in 15 minutes. We'll see each other once again, and you will be able to ask your questions in the chat box and get valuable gifts for asking your questions. This is the first forum which is held online because of the coronavirus crisis. So see you later in 15 minutes, and we hope to see you next year offline.